So anyway, I'm happy to see you all, but for a while I'm not going to listen to you. So I'm going to mute everybody, and then at the end, when I ask for questions, somebody has to remind me to help me remember to unmute you. So let's see if I can do this right.
Hi, Betty.
Okay, can you still hear me? I don't think I may be technically the host. Okay, as those of you who've been here before know, I'm hopelessly behind, and I hope I won't get even further behind as we go along, but I still wanted to do today, and I apologize if everything I do today is familiar to you, because I'm going to do a lot of current stuff. But before that, I want to go back and review a little bit. And what I was trying to get you to think about last time is that between 1890 and about 1920, you have the creation of this really organized movement called the Lost Cause. It's had a very distinctive view of the history of the Civil War in the South. They said, first and most importantly, the war was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. Would it be better if I just made me and not all of y'all at once? You want to keep I'm going to switch to speaker view. Okay, so first and foremost, the Lost Cause argues for the notion that the war is purely about states' rights, that secession was legal, and that even though there's nothing wrong with slavery, the war was not about slavery, and that since secession was constitutional, then the war is really a war in which the North attacks the South. They also explain away defeat by talking about the fact that they are defeated by overwhelming numbers and resources, which allows them to believe that they fought well enough to win, even though they didn't win. And if they'd had equal resources, equal industrial resources and numbers, they would have won. So that's kind of a virtual victory in their minds. But even more importantly, they talk about aristocratic leaders and the importance of following aristocratic leaders. And they also begin to create a vision of the good society. And they see the Confederacy itself as a model of the good society. And the good society is the one in which loyal, lower class followers follow aristocratic leaders. It's very much a structured society. And that women are loyal to men and slaves are loyal to their masters. In other words, it is a vision of an aristocratic dominated male society of white supremacy. And that's their vision of good society. And the celebration of the Confederacy actually projects that vision of what the good society should be. They also, at the same time, begin to talk about, by focusing on Sherman and others, what they see as the victimization of the South with the destruction of the South by the Union armies. So again, they create a vision of their history that allows themselves to feel vindicated, that allows themselves to be virtually victorious, but at the same time victimized. And that sense of victimization, I think, is very, very important for where we go from there. So again, the whole celebration of the Lost Cause does two things. It provides this vision of a society, but it also eases their own fears of dishonor and failure. And I think it's important to remember that. All of that then gets mixed up with a kind of traditional view of society in terms of loyalty to the group, in terms of respect for symbols, in terms of acceptance of authority. So you get this very conservative society. Much of what is still conservative in the 20th century South, it seems to me, is in part a function of the Lost Cause. At the same time, the Lost Cause is not a nationalist vision. They're not talking about starting the war again. A few of them are, but not many. And it's not even an ideology. Again, it's this sort of traditional view of the way society should operate, combined with a sort of sense of grievance. Again, I think some groups in the midst of the civil rights movement try to tie it to a kind of nationalist vision, and it doesn't work. The closest to that remaining, and there are always a few white Southerners who still believe in the Confederacy, The closest to that remaining becomes in the 1990s, the League of the South. And the League of the South still talks about secession, still talks about Southern nationalism. But it's very different from the Lost Cause in other respects, in that A, it's not led by the traditional elite of society. And secondly, they buy into this notion of a Celtic society of small farmers. It's very different from the aristocratic vision of the Old South. At the same time the Lost Cause develops, you have two competing visions. You have the White Norse vision, which continues to celebrate Union victory, continues to see secession as legal, if not treason, and continues to believe they were right. If pushed, they would even say the war was about slavery and emancipation was a good thing, though it doesn't lead to racial equality in their minds. But as the 20th century goes on, you have more and more people in the North who accept the Southern vision of the war, who talk about the militarization of society that I talked about last time. They see the Confederates as brave soldiers who fought honorably no matter what the cause, and recognize the honor. So that for the North, much of the emphasis comes on national unity, often around militarization, but with an acceptance of a kind of white supremacy. In other words, they're willing to de-emphasize issues like slavery in order to have white unity at the cost of Black equality, which is what often happens in American society. Meanwhile, African Americans continue to push their vision of the war, which makes slavery central, which makes emancipation the great accomplishment of the war, and in their minds should have led and continues to should lead to equality and full citizenship. Now, the other thing I was saying last time was that by the late 80s and 90s, if you look at the national level, if you look at sort of popular culture, you look at what the government's doing, you look at what museums are doing, you begin to see a change in which a vision of the war that doesn't ignore slavery and a vision of the war that doesn't celebrate the Confederate past has become the kind of dominant vision of the cultural and economic elite, both in the South and outside of the South, but especially outside of the South. And I think that's very, very important for understanding the dynamics of what happens in the 80s and 90s that we're going to talk about. So I want to talk about a few of the fights over Confederate symbolism over the last 30 or 40 years. I could talk about all kinds of things. If you read the New York Times today, you'll know we could have talked about the Robert E. Lee biscuit in Omaha, Nebraska, where they're having a fight over that. During the Civil Rights Movement is when I think most of the school names, street names, and all of that come in. We could talk about that. But I do want to mention one thing. As part of the school names, the name rebel shows up a lot. And that's really interesting in how all this has changed. Because if you read the leaders of the South and the leaders of the Lost Cause in the 1880s and 90s, if you call them a rebel, they would have bristled. They saw rebellion, which was for a long time the Union name of the war, as challenging their view of secession as legal and lumping them with rebellion in the streets in the 1880s and 90s by radicals. So they said, well, if you call Washington a rebel, we'll be a rebel, but otherwise we don't like the rebel. So they eschewed the name rebel, which in the 1950s and 60s becomes one of the major sort of symbols of the South. But instead of talking about all those things, I want to talk about three fights: Dixie, the flag, and then finally, to bring it back to the title of the course, the monument. Let's look at Dixie first. In 1982, one of my favorite conservatives, a guy by the name of John Shelton Reed, did a study of Southern identity. And despite the fact that Reed probably didn't want to find this, one of the things he found is that Southerners didn't care much about their past. And that if Southern identity was based on any sense of the Civil War and their past, it was gone. Or going fast. And instead he talks about, again, that traditional society and that sense of grievance. He says that's what really defines a Southern. But he was also interested in how the fights over things were going on. And he included whether or not high schools should play Dixie, along with whether or not you should fly the Confederate flag. So in the late 1970s, when Reed is doing his survey data, some of which you'll see in a minute if I get that far. The playing of Dixie was still a hotly debated topic. And over time, that's ended. In other words, if you look at public opinion polls today, nobody asks that question anymore. And I use the Agrarian Manifesto, I'll take my stand in class. And I talk about it with my students. I assume some of the older people among you know that the title, I'll Take My Stand, comes from Dixie. I have yet to have a student in my class who recognizes where that title comes from. They don't know Dixie. Where when I was in grammar school, it was in our songbook, and a lot of high schools and colleges football teams played it. Increasingly, they haven't. And Dixie is really not a big issue anymore because it's primarily disappeared from public life. Not too long ago, some of you remember ESPN screwed up and had a Dixie on one of their segments, and they very quickly apologized. Music like that is easily controlled by the elite. And as I've said, the sort of cultural elite and political elite, school leaders, college leaders are all part of that. And they have begun to move away from the celebration of the Confederacy. So you can see that in Dixie. The second thing we want to look at is the flag. And I may go more into detail here than you want me to, but let's do it anyway. Let's see. I want to share my screen. And show you some pictures. Well, it didn't work. Still didn't work. Okay. The Confederate flag. Let me show you two slides. That one and this one. No matter what you think about the Confederate flag, whether you're a big supporter of the Confederate flag or a big opponent of the Confederate flag, my guess is you have a much stronger emotional response to that flag than you do to this one. They are both Confederate flags. They were both symbols of the Confederacy. This, in fact, as you'll see in a minute, is the national flag of the Confederacy. This is really the official Confederate flag. But it doesn't have the emotional response. And part of what's happened is over the course of the 20th century, the associations of the Confederate flag have changed significantly. So to give you a little history, and just in case you want, this is the original Confederate flag, adopted very early by the Confederate Congress. And you'll immediately notice one thing, and that is how close it is to the American flag. And that is no accident. The Confederacy thought of itself as a legitimate heir to the American or United States tradition and consciously molded the flag after the American flag. In battle, there was a problem. You flew this, people get confused, and you can't tell who's who. So out of that came this flag, the Confederate battle flag, which becomes officially the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. Remember, I argued, well, never mind, I'll argue later, that that's in itself important. Sometimes it had a margin around it. Notice right off that it is square. And the official Confederate battle flag, which becomes the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, but increasingly more and more armies within the Confederacy. Now, there are a host of army flags in the Confederacy. It's square, not rectangular, as you usually see it today. But that was designed in part because the national flag got so confusing on the battlefield, this one made it easier to tell their flag from the American flag. So in '63, about halfway through, the Confederacy adopts this flag. They take the battle flag and they put it in the corner and they have a white field. It's tempting, and there were at least a couple of people who talked about it being a symbol of white supremacy, but most people disagree. There was a small problem with that flag, and that is if the wind wasn't blowing, it looked like you were surrendering. So right at the very end of the Confederacy, almost a month before they surrender, they add a red banner at the end so that people won't confuse that. The League of the South and a lot of the pro-Confederate protesters of late have started using this flag because they can say we're being official, but we still have the battle flag. Robert Bonner, who's written a book on the Confederate flag during the Confederacy, argues that the battle flag has become the official flag of the Confederacy, and it's testified to by this inclusion there. I don't agree with that, but he knows more than I do. Now, that's a brief history of the flag. I would argue two things. From the end of the war, well into the 1920s, two things are going on that we tend to forget about. First of all, the Confederate flag does not become the sort of daily symbol that it will later. The flag is flown primarily on ceremonial or memorial occasions. In other words, if you were having a Confederate monument unveiling, you would fly the Confederate flag. If you were having a Confederate reunion, you would fly the Confederate flag. Interestingly, on both of those occasions, they would have probably flown the Confederate flag and the American flag. So it's primarily memorial and celebratory. And I would argue that the battle flag has not yet become the single symbol of the South the way it will be in the 1950s and 60s. This is a United Confederate Veterans, and they make a point of making sure you know there are lots of Confederate flags. And if you look at the three major Confederate groups that form in the late 19th century, the veterans take the battle flag. The United Daughters of the Confederacy actually take the Stars and Bars, the official flag, which is still their official flag. And the Sons take the third flag of the Confederacy, and that's their official flag up until all the veterans die, and then they grab the battle flag. Here is a little advertisement for a bank that's playing on its Confederate ties. Note that there they include on the poster all the Confederate flags. You remember last time Eleanor asked about it, the picture of Winnie Davis had two of the Confederate flags on it. So I would say that by the early 20th century, at the heart of the lost cause, the battle flag hasn't become the single symbol the way it will later, nor has it become the kind of daily symbol that it will later. That begins to change. Well, the one exception to that here is the Mississippi State flag. And the Mississippi State flag is adopted in 1894 and includes the Confederate flag. And that's the only example of that, really. So beginning in the 20s and 30s, you begin to have more absorption with the flag in other ways. This is the KAs. The Kappa Alpha Order, you remember, makes the Confederate flag central to its identity for a very long time. They now claim to have repudiated it. The Kappa Alpha Order claims that Robert E. Lee is their spiritual founder, and they follow Lee's example everywhere. It's really interesting. I've read accounts that Lee didn't believe in fraternities, but my favorite example of that is Lee also believed ardently and preached to his students temperance, something that the Kappa Alpha Order didn't seem to adopt along with the flag. It begins to be used at football games, really early in the University of Virginia, Mississippi only after the Civil War. So in the 20s and 30s, you begin to have the flag being used in other occasions. During World War II and the Korean War, the Confederate battle flag shows up. Again, remember what I've been stressing, that one of the functions of Confederate memory, but also Northern Civil War memory, is militarization. So to have the flag in the midst of battle makes complete sense to a lot of people, both in World War II and in the Korean War. After World War II, the flag becomes a symbol in popular culture. One of the things, we'll see a chart in a little while about how the flag becomes, in many people's mind, a kind of symbol of Southern pride. This is in some ways the beginning of this and how they justify that. And so you have Confederate flag as kind of a popular culture item, including Confederate flag bikinis and Confederate flag flip-flops. The UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 50s, actually fights this. And they make a very logical argument, and that is, if the flag is sacred, if the flag is really about remembering the sacrifice of the veterans, then you don't wear flip-flops with a flag on it. And they lose that battle. And that remains very, very popular use of the flag. But more importantly, after World War II, the flag becomes an overt symbol of racism. It began a little bit with that association in the late 1930s. A lot of people, myself included, see a fundamental change in Southern attitudes beginning in the late 1930s when, for the first time, the Democratic Party supports a federal anti-lynching bill. And it's only stopped by a Southern filibuster in the Senate. And that makes white Southerners very nervous that the Democratic Party, which has kept the federal government at bay on race, is no longer dependable, and you begin to see a change. That first institutional manifestation of that change is 1948. And the Dixiecrat, or the Southern States Rights Party, emerges and runs Sean Thurman for President of the United States against both the Democrats and the Republicans as a third party, carries a few deep South states, doesn't get very far. But at that convention, people begin to fly the Confederate flag. And so that becomes a symbol of the Dixiecrat revolt in 1948. And you begin at that point to really identify the flag with the anti-civil rights movement. The White Citizens Council, the kind of uptown Klan of the 1950s, uses the Confederate flag as well. That association of the Southern past with the White Citizens Council is pretty amazing. In Baton Rouge, there is a White Citizens Council, but the same kind of organization took the name Southern Gentlemen. The Klan then really incorporates the Confederate flag on its uniforms, within its rituals, and segregationist mobs throughout the South in the 1950s and 60s begin to fly the Confederate flag in their demonstrations. Including a new dimension, which is anti-Semitism. One of the scholars who studies Civil War memory argues that you have the lost cause bleeding into a kind of Nazism. I don't see that. I see the fact that all of a sudden the Klan is embracing anti-Semitism is very much different from the lost cause itself. So in the 1950s and early 1960s then, the flag has very clearly been more closely identified. Let's get out of that for a minute. More closely identified with white supremacy than it ever has been before. And that is reified by what the state does. They also give the Confederate battle flag much more prominence publicly and protection in law. So several Southern states, not all of them, but several Southern states actually pass laws that make it illegal to disrespect the flag or to destroy the flag. It's in this period in the late 1950s that the flag goes up, flag becomes part of the Georgia state flag, something we'll see in a minute. It's in this period that both South Carolina and Alabama during the civil rights movement, but also during the Civil War centennial, which gave them an excuse, puts the Confederate flag on the state capitol. So suddenly, not only has the Confederate flag become the Confederate battle flag become a symbol of white supremacy more directly associated than ever before, but the state governments have ratified that. And the fights over that begin almost at once. In other words, the civil rights movement itself, African-American community begins to challenge the use of Confederate battle flag because of its racist assumptions, because it's such a symbol of the maintenance of white supremacy in the midst of the civil rights movement. South Carolina in the late 60s, early 70s, there's actually a young white radical who's arrested when he burns a Confederate flag in protest. He's never actually, he's never tried, he's never convicted. Last time I checked on him, he's an environmental activist now. So you begin to have the fights. The NAACP, especially throughout the 60s and 70s, begins to campaign against the official use of the flag on the South Carolina state capitol, on the Georgia flag, on the Mississippi flag. And so all of that is happening. At the same time, there's an interesting thing going on. And that is, now it won't work. There's one more example of the political use of the flag during the civil rights movement. Sorry about that. You have the Duke's flag. My nephews growing up watched the Dukes of Hazzard, and they didn't realize it was a Confederate flag. They thought it was the Duke's flag. It's a shame they didn't live in Louisiana, where it had been very appropriate. But the flag usage in the 70s and 80s tends to become much more lower class. Here is my favorite use of the Confederate flag as a do-rag. It's the amazing ability of American society to fuse cultures. Southern shoppers. Okay. So as that's happening, things really begin to change, as you may remember, between 1993 and 2001. This is the South Carolina Capitol, and the NAACP has been trying to get that flag off the state capitol for a long time by the early 1990s, and in fact had tried to boycott the tourism in South Carolina with very little, if any, effect. In 1993, Carol Moseley Braun, who some of you may remember, who was the first African-American woman to sit in the United States Senate, objects when the United Daughters of the Confederacy asks to renew its patent on its seal, which includes not the battle flag, but the stars and bars, the official flag. And Braun made a speech in the Senate talking about the association of that flag with slavery and the Confederacy and slavery. And it was a very moving speech that had an impact, and over the objections of a few people like Jesse Helms, the Senate and Congress refused to grant that patent. UDC can still have its symbol, it's just not patented. That launches this really major debate over the Confederate flag. The following year, the governor of Georgia, Zell Miller, calls for a change in this flag, which is the flag that Georgia had adopted in 1957. And Miller's justification is interesting. He admitted this racist association, but he's really worried because in 1996, as you remember, the Olympics are coming to Atlanta. And Miller's worried that this sort of racist symbol as an official state flag in the midst of the world's focus on Atlanta will undermine economic development. Again, the way this all functions as compared to the lost cause, I would argue that the lost cause, when it emerges in the 1890s, actually supports economic development. Now, when the flag is seen as threatening economic development, the cultural and economic elite begin to change. And so that sets off really a very interesting fight. There's a fight in Florida, which is solved very easily by because the flag was on the Capitol grounds and they just move it off when they redecorate and don't have any trouble. But it sets off a fight over the existence of the flag on the state flag in Georgia and Mississippi, and on the flying of the flag in Alabama and South Carolina on the Capitol. In Alabama, it moves fairly quickly. The governor, who's a Democrat, says take it down. He takes it down. People complain. So they put it back up, not on the Capitol dome, but on the Capitol grounds. South Carolina has the longest and most difficult fight. In '94, there's a move, actually at this point, by a Republican governor to stop the flying of the flag on the Capitol, which cost him his political career. And the flag fight at this point becomes highly partisan. In '94, when Buchanan's, '92 when Buchanan's running, or '96 when Buchanan's running for president, Buchanan makes keeping the flag atop the Capitol a big issue. The state Republican Party, in the midst of this fight, puts keeping the flag on the Capitol as part of its official statements. It makes it part of its platform, and the Democrats take the opposite. In 2000, you'll remember, in the midst of this fight, George Bush endorses keeping the flag on the Capitol. Later, John McCain will get caught up in that. And increasingly, it's becoming a conservative cause. In 2001, one of the most of the Confederate flag I've ever read was by Ann Coulter, who grew up in Connecticut and graduated from Cornell. And she makes it very much a fight to preserve tradition and Americanism. But the interesting thing is that between 94 and 2001, you have a series of compromises in which most of the states reach a compromise. In Georgia, they compromised by the legislature passing this flag, which incorporated all kinds of flags. A lot of people were still upset with that flag, and so they go back with a referendum, they vote it down, and they eventually adopt this flag, which some people say is bringing in yet another version of the Confederate flag. But this is now the official flag of Georgia, which is somewhat different than what before. The battle flag's gone. And again, my argument is the battle flag is as much a racist symbol from the 1960s as it was the 1860s, and this one isn't. In South Carolina, you have an interesting fight for a very long time. And eventually, at this stage in 2001, they do this, which is take the Confederate flag off the Capitol dome and fly it next to the Confederate monument on the Capitol steps. So in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, you have a compromise that calms things down. The exception of that is the state of Mississippi, which has a referendum which refuses to change the Mississippi state flag, something they're fighting over even as we speak. Well, actually, the legislature's approved a different thing, but that's 20 years later. So the interesting thing to me is at this stage, they reach various compromises. And you begin to see, as I'll show you in a minute, some fairly significant changes in attitude. The final step for South Carolina comes, let's go back, comes in 2015 with the killing of the Emanuel 9 in Charleston. And I want to talk about that at length because I think not at length, but it makes an important point. As you'll remember, Dylan Roof walks into the Emanuel AME Methodist Church in Charleston and murders 9 people. Very quickly, pictures of Ruth show up holding a Confederate flag. And very quickly, then the debate shifts to the Confederate flag. And very quickly, people make the argument that I've been trying to get you to think a little differently about, and that is that this is all a continuing civil war, and Dylan Roof is then a great proponent of the lost cause, battling for Confederate symbolism. Very interesting. Dylan Roof is radicalized by the Trayvon Martin shooting. And he comes to believe very quickly that there is a potential race war. In fact, he wants to start a race war because he believes in the current situation, African Americans are slowly taking over America and destroying white culture. So he gets on the internet, which is where everybody goes to be radicalized these days. And he finds a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens, which is actually a descendant group from the White Citizens Council of the 1950s. And they have been great flag defenders, and that's probably where he picks up the flag. Before the shooting, he goes on a tour of historic sites. And again, you'll see him with the Confederate flag, you'll see him at Confederate sites. 2 Washington Post reporters did a fascinating analysis of his tour. And they found it very interesting. He's very interested in plantations. But when he goes to Confederate sites, he doesn't really seem to care much. And he goes to Charleston, where any good neo-Confederate would want to go to Fort Sumter, and he doesn't even bother. While he's in prison, Dylan Roof makes a list of his 10 favorite movies. Gone with the Wind doesn't make the list. Ironically, 12 Years a Slave does. And Roof says, it's anti-white, but it's got good cinematography. Most interestingly, Roof's hero is not Robert E. Lee. It's Adolf Hitler. Even the Confederate flag, which he flies, if you look on his Facebook pages, you'll find that on his sweatshirt, he sewed on the flags of South Africa and Rhodesia. Any white supremacist flag will do. Most interestingly and most significantly, and I'll come back to this, but I want to talk now, printed it out, but I guess I'll just paraphrase it. If you read Roof's manifesto, it includes a fascinating statement. Again, he believes African Americans are taking over the world and going to ruin America and take over from white people. And he says at one point, you know, if what people say is true, that African Americans have been treated so horribly in the past, then their desire to take over would make sense. Now, very few people have commented on that statement, but I find it fascinating. It's almost as if Roof is saying, if we really admit the history of the treatment of African Americans in American society is true, then maybe they've got a case. Maybe something has to be done. Now, he's not going quite there, but that's what he's thinking. And that's why he spends so much time at plantations. He's hoping to find evidence that they do. So after the Roof shooting, after the murder of the Emanuel Nine, then South Carolina takes one more step, and Alabama takes one more step, and the flags come off of the Capitol grounds. Now, I find these flag fights interesting. Some of it at times appears to be about Confederate heritage and Confederate ancestors. I know the South Carolina debate the best, and if you read the legislative records, there are people within the South Carolina legislature who stand up and talk about their Confederate ancestors. Interestingly, one of the most vocal is a guy named Joe Wilson, who you may remember as a congressman who shouted out during an inaugural address by Barack Obama, "You lie." And he mentions his Confederate ancestors. But there's so much more going on here than that. Again, one of the other interesting things, if you look at the South Carolina fight, if you look at the Mississippi fight, what you find is the religious elite, the cultural elite, the political elite, and especially the economic elite tends to be in favor of taking the flag down. It's other people who oppose it. Sometimes it's purely a matter of racial politics. You will find people who will say, we can't make another concession to black people. They'll say, we've done so much to make black people happy, this is just one more thing and we're not going to do it. In other words, blacks want it to come down, therefore we don't. But the flag has also become not only a symbol of white supremacy in the civil rights movement and to a certain extent in the Confederacy, but of white grievance. And so you protect it for that reason. It's an attempt to preserve a white domination of society against what they see. The other thing that you'll see over and over in debate, they'll say, well, taking the Confederate flag down is just a matter of political correctness. And political correctness has become a key word to say this is what the cultural elite want and we don't. And I think more than, along with the other factors, that's another factor that you see coming out in the flag fights. Now, I want to show you some charts, and I'm running out of time again, and I want to do them fast, but they're fascinating, and I think you'll find them interesting because they talk about what I'm trying to say, which is this shift. So let's look at a whole bunch of polling data. I love polling data. It gives you the illusion of accuracy. So if you look at what's happening in support for the Confederate battle flag, and we've got a lot better data on the flag than we do on monuments, but I'll get to that. In 2011, on the eve of the sesquicentennial, they asked, do you display the flag? Only 8% of Americans do. And even if you went to white Southerners, it doesn't go up much past 12. If you look and say, what's your reaction to the Confederate flag? Most people say neither. In other words, you have this tremendous debate over something that most people don't do. Now, in 1982, when they asked, should you use the Confederate flag in public schools? Because its symbol in high schools at that point was pretty important. You see a fair amount of regional distinction But again, the approval rate in the South especially, but the nation's not too, still fairly high. If you ask people what the Confederate flag symbolizes, the big debate is between Southern pride and racism. And here you see polls from 92 all the way up to 2015. And you see a continued majority saying Southern pride. Only 38% in 2015 said racism. But again, over time, as these debates go on, as that flag fight from 94 to 2001 went on, you begin to increase the number of people who will talk about it standing for racism, decrease the number of people who see it standing for Southern pride. Should you use it officially? This is talking about either on the state flags or on the state capitol. The 94 Southern Focus poll is fascinating in that you see absolutely no difference, well, virtually, between Northern and Southern whites' attitude toward the use of the Confederate flag. By 2000, we'll look at regional stuff later, but 2000, what had been 38% has gone up. You see a real shift beginning. In 2020, if you look at all categories, 51% disapprove of using the Confederate flag. So a bare majority now. And again, you'll see that we'll go back to the race, but that has now said, okay, we don't approve of the public use of the Confederate flag. Race, if you look at it, is fairly clear. There's a dramatic difference between the way whites and blacks view this. Again, that's totally, totally understandable. If you look at region, it gets interesting. As late as 94, if you'll see the top chart, again, there wasn't a tremendous difference between Northerners and Southerners over the use of the public use of the flag. By 2000, after the flag fights, and especially in 2015 after Roof, that begins to go up outside of the South, less so in the South. It goes up in the South, but not as dramatically as in the South. And the regional differences are still significant. But this is the fascinating one. In 1994, before the Confederate flag fights, there was not a tremendous urban-rural split on whether or not you should have public use of the flag. By 2015, there's a dramatic rural-urban split. 62% of urban dwellers say the flag ought to come down. 60% of rural dwellers say it shouldn't. You have an equally dramatic shift in political parties. In 1994, the Democrats' agreement or disagreement, sorry about the E's, over whether or not the flag should come down are almost the same. By 2015, 70% of Democrats say take it down to 54% of Republicans. This is a very crude statistical measure, but at least one of my statistics friends says it's not altogether true. This is just talking about the percentage of difference. And what you see very clearly is it shifts over time between 1992 and 2015. But what used to be even race and region is not all that different. I mean, the fascinating thing is you can actually find polls in 2015, where the Midwest actually has more support for the official use of the flag than the South does. And if you look outside the South, you see the Confederate flag is spread, particularly in rural regions. I've had people in Pennsylvania talk about support flag. I've had friends who say if you travel through rural Michigan, you see the flag all the time. There's enough Confederate flags being flying in rural Vermont that Vermont Public Radio did a story on it not too long ago. So again, it's not just regional. So the regional split is still there. Southerners still support the flag more than other regions do. But the big difference now, to some extent, is wealth and education. The cultural elite has shifted. And rural urban and Democrat Republican. In 2020, nothing's changed much. Okay. Public places, again, regional distinctions are there, but not as big as you would think. The big difference is the coast and the heartland. Rural, urban, coast, heartland. If that sounds familiar, it should. Okay, this is even more interesting. Remember what I said about Dillon Roof? That if we admit there was mistreatment of blacks, then something has to happen. If you ask people, does black history make a difference? Is that why it is? That's where you have this gigantic difference. If history makes it hard for blacks to get ahead, then 58% of South Carolinians, for God's sake, favor taking the flag down. But if you don't believe it's hard, 71% say keep it up. Ask it another way. Is the government doing too much? Same pattern. So again, this is tied in many ways to race. Now, I'm running out of time yet again. I'm glad I left out the part I left out. What about Confederate monuments? Confederate monuments are harder to understand. It's not clear when the fight starts over Confederate monuments. There's opposition to erecting Confederate monuments in the 1890s into the early 20th century. I've run across, almost by accident, a Chicago Defender. Chicago Defender is a major black newspaper in the country for much of the 20th century. And in 1929, they asked sort of public response to whether or not Confederate monuments come down, and at least 3 people wrote in and said they should. So there's always been some opposition. But my argument would be that the Confederate monument never gets as caught up in the civil rights movement as a flag does, and that makes a difference. Moreover, it's really fascinating to figure out how you interpret Confederate monuments, and I think this is interesting because of how we deal with white supremacy. A lot of my fellow historians right now are saying, well, the monument was put up primarily for white supremacy and primarily to intimidate blacks. And there's a modicum of truth to that. The way you really intimidated blacks was lynching. And the lynching thing, we don't really understand where Confederate monuments are. We don't understand how many they are. We don't understand where they are. There have been 4 or 5 studies. None of them are complete. But if you look at lynching data compared to Confederate monuments, what you find is that 2 states, Texas and Georgia, were among the top 4 in Confederate monuments and the top 4 in lynching. But 2 of the states that have the most Confederate monuments, North Carolina and Virginia, are actually at the bottom of states with lynching. Virginia has the most Confederate monuments and almost fewer lynchings in New York State. I think Confederate monuments are a symbol of white supremacy, but it's more than that. Part of it is, again, this honoring of the Confederate soldier, this vindicating the South, this memory of their soldiers, and that gets mixed up with his vision of society. And I think it's important to remember that and not make the direction too clear with white supremacy, because again, that's the way white supremacy has worked. And if we're understanding how to take it apart, you have to understand that it often sort of comes in on little cat's feet, not beating people over the head. Roof's actions led to a new look at Confederate monuments. There were a few before that, but it's really Roof. There were fights over monuments, Confederate monuments, at the University of Texas. Big fight frequently in Memphis over the Nathan Bedford Forrest Monument early on. The Texas story I love, I got to tell it, even though there's 6 Confederate monuments at the University of Texas. One of them was to Jefferson Davis, one of them was to Woodrow Wilson, and then 4 Confederate leaders, Robert E. Lee and others. And after the first report saying take them all down, the university president says, well, we're going to take Jefferson Davis down and we're going to take Wilson down. They were across from each other. He says, we're taking Jefferson Davis down because of the Confederacy. We're taking Wilson down for symmetry, which I just thought was a great administrative dodge. That was after Roof. Then you have Charlottesville. And Charlottesville associates the Confederate monuments with racism as probably never before. But again, think about what happens in Charlottesville. And the other aspect of that is President Trump's statements make it worse and make it more prominent. But think about Charlottesville. The League of the South was there. Michael Hill and some of his supporters were there, as they were in New Orleans. They were at New Orleans when the Lee Monument came down, and the New Orleans police, who rarely get credit for much, handled that situation so much better than the police in Charlottesville did, which kept us from being Charlottesville. But in Charlottesville, those demonstrations are fascinating. The League of the South's there. But the night before, you have anti-Semitic statements and tiki torches, which have nothing to do with the lost cause. Many of the protesters in Charlottesville were actually from the Midwest. The young man who's convicted of murdering one of the women watching the counter-protesters was from the Midwest. In other words, it's hard to see this embrace of the Lee Monument. And so what's happening in Charlottesville is that white supremacists and white nationalists are embracing the Lee Monument. To some extent, it makes sense. I mean, Lee himself was an ardent supporter of white supremacy. Lee himself defined American citizenship not in terms of values, but in terms of sort of family and loyalty. But the question will become how much Charlottesville and President Trump's response to it is going to make the monuments as close to a symbol of white supremacy as a flag is. A majority of Americans still oppose taking down the monuments. About 100 or more have come down, but they haven't. Now, how does this all fit together? All these fights and what they say about what we're going through right now. Clearly, there's greater Southern support for the flag and for the monuments than there is outside of the South, but not a great deal more support. And some of that is loyalty to ancestors. Some of that is continuing interest in the Civil War. Some of that is the South's greater degree of racism. But the interesting thing is that the battle over Confederate symbolism has now been incorporated into a larger political and cultural battle. Confederate symbols have become a sign of grievance. Confederate symbols have become a way to defy the cultural elite. So what you find in support of the Confederate symbols now are rural-urban splits and to a large extent, a partisan split. And so, and the geographic split is interesting. It's the heartland. It's the South and the Midwest against the coast. So it's been factored in to the same sort of cultural divide that is deeply, deeply troubling our country. I don't know what's going to happen with the monuments, but the interesting thing, if you look at the polling data, which I'll spare you right now, what hasn't shifted is the educational and financial elite. In other words, they had clearly turned against the flag. They haven't as clearly turned against the monuments. They don't see the monuments, I don't think, as much a threat to economic development as possible. The fact that over the last 20 years, the cultural elite has become take down the monuments, take down the flag, that means the people who resent them, rural Republicans, embrace the flag because, again, this is political correctness. This is so the flag and the monuments have become a symbol of traditional American values as well as the Confederacy, which is making this fight much more complicated, but also means we've got to understand the deep cultural divide, not just say, well, if we get over the Civil War. On the other hand, it does. Again, one of the reasons they support this is to admit the racism inherent in these symbols is also to raise the issue of whether our past and our racist past demands action, the roof question for me. And you see that the people who want to deny that past are the ones who most support the flag. And what I'll try to do in the last, I'm trying to beg an extra class, maybe the last 2 classes, is try to talk about the history itself. Okay, I will unmute you, I hope, and you can ask questions. He says, hopefully. Okay, somebody say something to see if I did it right.
Okay. I unmuted myself.
Okay,
But,
you all should be unmuted. Questions?
James, I love the story about the flag with the first Confederate national flag with the white. That was all white, not the first one, but the one that
The
was
second one.
the second one. Yeah, That's a great story because people interpret it as a surrender flag.
Yep, it was a problem. Wind wasn't blowing, you were in trouble.
Yeah, it was like a demonstrable problem on the battlefield.
What now?
It was a demonstrable problem on the
Yeah,
battlefield.
enough that they added.
Wow.
You may notice what our state capitol has done. We had a fight 10 or 15 years ago about the battle flag in the state capitol, and we got it out, and they replaced it with the first flag of the Confederacy. The last time I was in the Capitol, they had snuck the third flag back in, which annoyed me. But
well, again, since nobody's asking a truly meaningful question, I'll ask one that seems like trivia. I noticed that on the early flags and some of the reproductions, the orientation of the stars was random, you might say. Some of them were upside down and every which way. And on the more recent ones, it's extremely ordered. They're all, the point is straight up on the stars. Do you know if there's any significance to that? Like you had a photo of an original one from the Civil War, and the stars were in different orientations. Any?
well, in the circle, that may have been a factor. Other than that, I have no idea and have never thought about that.
No, this was in the battle flag.
No, I apologize. I don't know.
It's probably because they're handmade. They're not, manufactured all the
Sure.
same way.
But if you're sewing one, you can easily sew it so all the points point the same direction.
You can, but you're probably not thinking about that.
Maybe not.
I thought the different number of stars was interesting.
Yeah.
Some had 7 stars.
The
and some
usual
had-
Confederate battle flag counts a couple of states that weren't really in the Confederacy.
What does the Louisiana battle flag look like? I didn't know I haven't been in the state capitol. I didn't know they flew there.
No, what they did is they had flown, they have that list of all the flags that have flown over Louisiana.
Okay.
So I forget, it's been a very long time. I've been involved in lots of Confederate flag fights and I lose track. The battle flag was being flown as the Confederacy. And so at that point, some people complained and they switched it for the Stars and Bars, the first flag. And then I don't know when, but the last time I was in the Capitol, I noticed they had changed it for the third flag.
Mhm.
And the flag supporters, as best I can tell, have gotten more savvy. And that is having had to deal with people who said, well, that's not even a real Confederate flag. They've started using the third flag because then they can say it's official, but it still has a battle flag in it. So in the corner of one flag, the battlefield was back in the state capitol, which is what I don't know.
Was our state flag always the pelican and the blue?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think,
I don't know.
again,
And you know the whole the story of the high school student, or no, actually a friend of mine who discovered that they'd left the blood off of the pelican and got it put back, and that was a great victory for flagmanship.
I think there was briefly a
Yeah.
Louisiana flag, very briefly, before in the process of secession. But I also had some say in that flag business in the Capitol. And my argument was you need to use the first flag because they were arguing about the Spanish flag and the French flag. I said, no, you have to use the first flag, the one that was there at the time that Louisiana fell under whatever that political jurisdiction was. And I guess that temporarily held the day, but there was some fellow who was, I think, a Confederate veteran. No, Sons of the Confederacy was just adamant that it had to be the battle flag.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, for them, it's become the flag. And again, I think the third flag, which only was official for a month, for heaven's sakes, when most of Louisiana was under Union control, has become their darling. They actually use that in their protests more and more. Because I mentioned before, the League of the South now has its own flag, which is a white flag with a black cross on it. It looks like
The naming of buildings will become what replaces the flag, the monuments. Will it be the
Well, I'm still not sure what's going to happen with the monuments. I think the buildings are going to be interesting. They're getting changed faster than the monuments do.
It's also less expensive to change a building name than it is to take down a monument.
Well, and in the day when universities are selling, quote, naming rights to the highest bidder changing building names is no big deal anymore.
Mhm. Mhm.
At the very end, you alluded to traditional American values, and so maybe you'll talk about this later, because it seems really ironic to me. I would think that capitalism would maybe fall into that category, and yet you could also argue that that's the reason we have the elites now. They're sort of a product of capitalism, and I don't know, maybe you're going to talk about this more in the history section.
Gee, Gads, no, I probably should. Now, just giving me more work to do. Again, to me, the interesting thing has been the shift. I mean, I think the lost cause very much supported the emergence of an industrialized market economy in the South, where now support for the Confederacy is seen by a lot of those same international business people as dangerous for capitalist development. And so that's a big shift. I mean, the problem is everything's so confused on that. In other words, you've got the left in the streets railing about capitalism and associating with slavery, something I will talk about next time. But at the same time, the alt-right picks its own capitalists not to like, with Soros, and they're turning on Google and Facebook. So the sort of simple capitalist, non-capitalist split in this fight, I don't think works as well as it would have in the 1880s and 1890s, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. So, I mean, I guess really the question is, when we talk about traditional American values, you know, mom and apple pie, but what are we talking about?
Well, for these people, I think they're talking about a very structured society. I mean, again, this is to me one of the things that if people talked about the lost cause more fully would help in a lot of different ways, in that it's not just white supremacy. It's also designed to create a loyal Southern white lower class. It's also designed to promote a traditional view of women's roles. And so if you support the lost cause in and of itself, it fits very nicely with what a lot of the people who are now in that side of the cultural split, traditional female values, conservative view of the social order, I mean, they come together quite nicely.
In that regard, it's been sort of successful, right?
Yes. I mean, to me, the irony of the lost cause, I'm always criticized by people because I apparently said at one point it doesn't have any impact. I think the thing that's fascinating about all this is the way in which history has supported a very conservative social order in the South for a very long time. It helped create that, even as the sort of absolute loyalty to a Confederate nationalism or Confederate ideology disappeared. The sort of subversive intent of the way memory functioned turned out to be even more impressive. That's kind of what I was trying to say with the monuments, and I didn't say very well. If you just say they were put up to intimidate black people, then you say, oh, well, hell yeah, let's take those suckers down. But if you believe, which is what most of the 51% who want to keep them up believe is that they're actually put up for this larger purpose of ratifying the sacrifice of these white soldiers and ratifying the notion of social order. Yeah, that's true, but that comes with it this vision of white supremacy. And so if you want to attack white supremacy in American society, you just can't say every time you see racism, it's gone. You got to look at how the whole structure of society and the values of white people promote it. And I think that's why the monument fight's going to be a little different from the flag fight. That and the fact that, again, the monuments didn't get used as blatantly in the civil rights movement as the battle flag did.
Gaines, I thought one of the most interesting statistics you showed was the divide between rural and urban. And I think I don't know that I've heard anyone reflect very much on kind of what is rural America? You know, who are the people that are in rural America, and how does that lead them to a certain orientation? I have the sense that people that live in rural America are people whose families were living in those same places and they have never left. And I can see how that contributes to a more conservative view, that one more tied to the view of past generations, that kind of thing. But I think it'd be interesting to reflect on, and I'm sure there's plenty of thinking and writing on that subject, but kind of who is urban America and how do they come to have the mindset that they seem to display?
Yeah. No, I think that's true. One thing I left out that you may be interested in, one of the things that happens with the monuments that also complicates that fight is a number of southern states have passed what they call heritage protection laws, which tries to make it illegal to take down a Confederate monument. The first of them was actually passed during the Lost Cause phenomenon. Virginia passes it in 1904. All the rest of them date 2000 and later. Both Georgia's and South Carolina's are actually passed as part of the compromise to get the flag off the Capitol or off the flag. And so they say, okay, we'll do this, but you can't go after the monuments. The rest of them are 2013 to 2017. And that's fascinating. And, you know, we tried to pass one in Louisiana, and the legislature unusually did the right thing and didn't pass one. What's happened is, if you look at where monuments are coming down, they're coming down in urban areas where you have a heavily black population and a Democratic government, or they're coming down in university towns, Austin, Chapel Hill, places like that. And what the state legislatures are doing is fascinating, and it's not reenacting the Civil War. It's not even reenacting Reconstruction. It's reenacting post-Reconstruction politics. And what the legislatures are doing is saying local control is cool until it's controlled by Democrats and blacks. And therefore we'll use state power to stop them from doing stuff. Everybody says that Louisiana, for instance, has too much power at the state level and not enough power at the local level, and blame it on Huey Long. I'm convinced, without ever having done the research, that a lot of that dates from the post-Reconstruction period. When the Democrats retake control after Reconstruction, but you still have black voting in a lot of areas and some black control at local levels, that's when you shift it from the local to the state level. And that's exactly what the heritage monuments are trying to do. The Republicans who control the state legislature say, okay, let's stop these local towns from doing it. So it's a fascinating example of the limits of local control in a lot of conservatives' mind. I will tell you one more story, Cordell, on Who's Rural America. The most fascinating in the podcast that the Vermont radio did on flying the Confederate flag in rural Vermont, most of the people who flew them wouldn't talk to him. But they talked to one guy who said, no, I'm going to fly the flag. I have a right, blah, blah. Blacks have gotten too much. Turns out he's got an African-American grandchild. And even more interestingly, he's a Penobscot Indian. So again, it's not history in all cases. It's this cultural divide. And I think rural America, more than anything else, is an area that feels they're being left behind by a cultural and economic elite that doesn't care about it.
Yeah, we drive through vast rural areas most summers on our vacation, and it's so easy. You drive through these areas, and obviously the people there do not have the same concerns of the coastal people, the urban people, and so it's, you know, all the things that urban people find problematic are non-issues to people in rural areas. And I'm sure vice versa. You know, urban people can't imagine what concerns a rural person. I mean, they're completely different. And I often think it would be nice if we could have a little exchange program, you know. Urban people go to the country for a week and rural people go to the city for a week and learn to just understand, you know, why do urban people worry about controlling our water, you know, and why.
I can make a comment about an urbanite like myself moving to rural Montana. My former father-in-law, after I'd worked on the ranch for the summer, told me that hiring me was like losing 4 good men.
Oh dear.
Okay, we're way over, and I appreciate your questions, and I appreciate your involvement. Again, what I'll try to do next week is I'll go back and start over, and I'll look at the history of some of this stuff and try to put it together. And I won't explain rural attitudes, but try to bring it both together, looking at the history and critique in many ways the Southern version of Southern history that you get in the law scholars. So go center yourselves and thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.